The seasons turned, and spring returned to the mountain, not with the hesitant, reluctant thaw of the year before, but with a full-throated, confident rush of life. The creek, fed by the melting snows, sang a boisterous song. The burned-over hillside, which had been a stark, black wound, was now covered in a soft, verdant fuzz of new grass and fireweed, its brilliant magenta blossoms a testament to the land's indomitable power of renewal. Life in the cabin had settled into a rhythm as steady and as natural as the turning earth. The sharp edges of survival had been worn smooth by the daily friction of domesticity, leaving behind a warm, polished grain of contentment. The conflicts that had once defined their existence, the town's scorn, a man's malice, the impersonal threat of progress had receded, melting away like the last of the winter snow. What remained were the small, essential challenges of a life being built, the tilling of a new garden plot, the mending of a fence, the endless, delightful, and exhausting work of raising a child. On a warm afternoon, the kind that smells of sun on pine needles, Brian sat on the porch bench, a block of aspen wood in his lap. He was not carving a rose this time. With the same patient, meticulous skill, he was coaxing the shape of a small horse from the wood. Its head was arched, its legs were poised for a gallop, its tiny ears were pricked with a lively alertness. It was a creature of pure, joyful energy, captured in wood by a father's loving hands. At his feet, Victoria, now a sturdy toddler with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined chin, played with a collection of smooth river stones. She would stack them, watch them tumble, and then let out a delighted, gurgling laugh, the sound as clear and as musical as the nearby creek. She was a child of the mountain, sure-footed and curious, her world a safe and wondrous place bounded by the love of her family. Rachel sat in a rocking chair nearby, a basket of mending in her lap, though her hands were still. She watched her husband and her daughter, a quiet, profound happiness swelling in her chest. Her hand rested on the gentle, familiar curve of her belly. The cradle, which had stood as a symbol of hope, would soon be needed again. Her journey, which had begun in shame and desperation, had come full circle. She was no longer a woman defined by her past, but a woman firmly rooted in a future she was actively creating. "He is getting faster," she said, her voice soft. Brian looked up from his carving, a rare, small smile touching the corners of his mouth. "He has your knack for talking his way into a good deal." They were speaking of Jerry, true to his word. He had bought a small, struggling ranch in the valley, not the prime land of Matthew White's former empire, but a good piece of bottomland with a solid house and a sturdy barn. With a loan from Jerry's California savings and Brian's knowledge of lumber and livestock, they were turning it into a thriving concern. Jerry, the charming rover, had finally put down roots, becoming a respected figure in the community, his social grace the perfect complement to Brian's quiet competence. He was a frequent visitor to the cabin, his arrival always heralded by a cheerful shout and a bag of treats from town for his niece. Later that afternoon, they had other visitors. A wagon, drawn by two sturdy plow horses, made its way slowly up the now well-worn path to the cabin. It was Mr. and Mrs. Taylor from the Mercantile. A year ago, their faces had been masks of pinched disapproval. Now, they were wreathed in genuine, friendly smiles. "We were coming up to check on our woodlot," Mr. Taylor called out, "reining in the horses, and Mrs. Taylor here insisted on packing enough food to feed a logging crew." Mrs. Taylor bustled down from the wagon, carrying a large basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Nonsense," she said, her voice warm. "I just knew Rachel would be tired of her own cooking. And I brought something for the little one." She produced a small, beautifully stitched rag doll, which she handed to a wide-eyed Victoria. They spread a blanket in the clearing and shared a meal of fried chicken, potato salad, and fresh-baked bread. The Taylors spoke of the town, of the new schoolhouse being built, of the quiet, steady work of the railroad crews down in the valley. They spoke of the new atmosphere in Millbrook, of a decency that was no longer loud and performative, but quiet and genuine. They did not mention Matthew White by name, but his absence was a palpable presence, a void that had been filled by a healthier, more honest community spirit. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, golden fingers of light across the valley, Rachel looked down from their perch on the mountain. In the distance, she could see them, the twin steel ribbons of the railroad tracks, but they were not a wound, not a scar. They did not cut a straight, arrogant gash across the land. They curved, a graceful, sweeping arc that followed the contours of the valley, respectfully skirting the foothills of the mountain and the unseen boundaries of the Utes' sacred lands. The tracks were not a symbol of conquest, but of compromise. They were proof that progress did not have to be a destructive force, that the relentless march of the future could be guided by wisdom and respect. That night, after their guests had departed and the cabin was once again filled with a peaceful, familial quiet, Rachel stood for a moment by the cradle. It stood in the corner, its pale wood glowing in the soft lamplight, the rabbit fur lining still soft and welcoming. It had been the first true promise of this new life, a testament to a quiet man's hope. Soon, it would hold a new baby, a new beginning. It was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was a repository of their story, a family tree carved from wood, its roots sunk deep into the rich soil of this mountain. Brian came and stood behind her, his large hands resting gently on her shoulders. They stood in silence for a long time, watching their daughter sleep, listening to the quiet breathing of their home. There were no more dramatic twists waiting for them around the bend, no more villains to be vanquished, no more earth-shaking revelations. The great, defining conflicts of their lives were over. Rachel leaned back against him, feeling the steady, reassuring strength of his presence. She understood now that true happiness was not a destination you arrived at after a long and perilous journey. It was not a grand prize won at the end of a battle. It was a quieter, more patient thing. It was the house you built, board by board. It was the fire you tended, log by log. It was the daily, repeated choice to meet the world not with fear, but with courage, responsibility, and a quiet, unshakable love. It was a peace that had been hard-earned, and for that reason, it was a peace that would endure. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people. The sun was a hammer over the town square, beating down on the baked earth until the heat rose in shimmering waves. It was the kind of heat that made tempers short and drew the cruelty out of men like poison from a snake bite. Nearly all of Ash Creek had gathered, their faces turned toward the crude wooden platform erected in front of the jail. They stood in clusters, the respectable women under the scant shade of the general store's awning, their husbands and sons squinting in the full, brutal glare of noon. It was a spectacle, and in a town starved for diversion, a man's misery was as good as a traveling show. The sheriff, a man whose spine was as flexible as his income required, dragged Calder Boone onto the platform. The chains on Calder's wrists and ankles clanked with a heavy, final sound. He was a ruin of a man. A fresh bruise purpled one side of his face, swelling his eyes shut. His tangled beard was matted with dust and dried blood. But he stood straight, his broad shoulders squared against the weight of the chains and the 100 pairs of eyes fixed on him. He did not look at the crowd. His gaze was fixed somewhere beyond them, on the unwavering line of the horizon. A small whimper drew the crowd's attention. The sheriff's deputy prodded Jesse forward. The boy was a splinter of a thing, all sharp angles and hollows, swimming in clothes that were little more than rags. He stumbled to his father's side and wrapped both arms around Calder's leg, hiding his face against the coarse fabric of his trousers. His small hand was clenched so tightly around his wooden cross that his knuckles were white. A man named Jasper, who sold horses on Tuesdays and served as the town's auctioneer whenever the need arose, stepped onto the platform. He was a fleshy man with a voice that oozed like cheap oil. "All right, folks, settle down, he boomed, spreading his arms wide. "What we have here is a unique opportunity. The town of Ash Creek has incurred significant expense subduing this wild creature." He gestured to Calder as if he were a piece of livestock. "And we have determined that the best way to recoup our losses and ensure public safety is to offer his labor for a period of 1 year. A murmur went through the crowd. This was business. This was acceptable. Silas Rourke stepped forward from the shade, his voice cutting through the noise. "Labor is a generous word. Jasper, this mountain beast is not fit to be called a man. He's a danger to our women, a threat to our children. He brought the wild down from the hills, and he belongs in a cage." A chorus of agreement rose from the men around him. They saw Calder not as a man who had lost everything, but as a symbol of the untamed wilderness they were trying to conquer. He was the fear of the unknown, given flesh and blood. Jasper smiled, sensing his moment. "Mr. Rourke makes a fine point, which is why the winning bidder will be responsible for his keep and his good behavior. Think of it, a full year of hard labor. Strong back, this one. Built for clearing timber or hauling rock." He walked over and slapped Calder's shoulder. The sound was a flat, meaty thud. Calder didn't flinch, but Jesse's small body trembled violently. "What am I bid for this prime specimen? Do I hear $20? Silence. The only sound was the wind, whispering its dry secrets across the square. $10. Then, Jasper's smile faltered. $10 for a year of work. You will not find a better bargain. A man in the back of the crowd laughed. "I will give you $2. Jasper, just to see if he can be tamed." More laughter rippled through the onlookers. The auction was becoming a joke, a public humiliation. Rourke folded his arms, a smug look on his face. This was exactly what he wanted. He wanted Calder broken, his spirit ground into the same red dust that covered the street. It was then that the crowd parted, like a slow tide receding from the shore. The people stepped back to create a narrow path. May Collins walked through it. She wore her plain church dress, and she moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her hands resting on the swell of her belly. She did not look at the faces that turned to stare at her, a mixture of shock and contempt in their eyes. Her focus was entirely on the platform, on the man in chains and the small boy clinging to him. She stopped at the foot of the platform, the sun full on her face. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried across the silent square with perfect clarity. $30. Jasper's jaw dropped. The laughter in the crowd died in an instant. Every eye swung from May to the platform and back again. Silas Rourke's smug expression curdled into one of disbelief, then fury. $30, Jasper stammered, recovering himself. "I have a bid of $30 from Miss Collins. Do I hear 35? He looked hopefully at Rourke, but the rancher was staring at May. His eyes narrowed to slits. He saw this not as an act of compassion, but as a personal challenge. Another rejection thrown in his face for the whole town to see. $30. Going once, Jasper called out, his voice regaining its oily rhythm. Going twice. As the silence stretched, a woman in a gingham bonnet turned to her neighbor, her voice a sharp, carrying whisper that seemed to give voice to the entire town's astonishment. A pregnant woman bought a beaten mountain man and his son at this auction. What happened next would leave the whole town in tears. The words hung in the hot, still air, less a piece of gossip than a prophecy. "Sold!" Jasper finally yelled, slamming his hand down on a barrelhead. to Miss Collins for $30. May walked to the barrel and carefully counted out the coins from a small cloth purse. The silver and copper clinked, each sound a final, irrevocable note. It was almost everything she had in the world. She pushed the stack of coins toward Jasper, her hand steady. The sheriff, his face a mask of confusion, stepped forward. He unlocked a heavy rusted key from his belt and held it out to her. May took it. The iron was warm from the sun, heavy with the weight of its purpose. With the key in her hand, she walked up the 3 steps to the platform. She knelt, her movements slow and careful because of her child. In front of Calder, she did not speak. She simply inserted the key into the lock of his ankle shackles. For the first time, Calder looked at her. His one good eye was a startling blue, a shard of clear sky in his battered face. There was no gratitude in it, only a profound and bottomless confusion. He could not understand. The lock clicked open. She moved to the other ankle, and then to his wrists. The heavy chains fell away, landing in the dust with a dull thud. Calder slowly, stiffly, rubbed his wrists, the raw red skin a stark contrast to his weathered hands. May then turned her attention to Jesse. The boy was staring at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. She offered him a small, hesitant smile. "It is all right," she said softly. Rourke could stand it no longer. He strode to the platform, his face dark with rage. "Collins," he snarled, his voice a low growl meant only for her. "What foolish game are you playing?" "It is no game. Mr. Rourke, I paid a debt." "A debt?" he scoffed. "You owe this creature nothing." "I paid the town's debt," she replied, her voice still quiet but unyielding. "Now they belong with me." Rourke leaned closer, his shadow falling over her. "You will regret this. I promise you that. This land has a way of swallowing up foolish women who make powerful enemies." May met his gaze and did not look away. She simply stood, the key still clutched in her hand, and waited for him to move, defeated for the moment. Rourke spun on his heel and stalked back into the crowd, shoving men out of his way. As May turned to lead Calder and Jesse from the platform, she caught the eye of Hannah Pike, the town midwife. The old woman was standing near the edge of the crowd, her face weathered into a map of wrinkles. She gave May a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a look of understanding, of shared strength. As May passed, the old woman's voice was a low murmur against the silence of the crowd. "You have just chosen the hard road, child." May knew it. She could feel it in the weight of the stairs on her back as she led the silent man and his terrified son away from the square. The road was hard, and it was long. But as her hand instinctively went to the life stirring within her, she knew it was the only road she could have taken. They walked past the storefronts and the false salutes to civilization, heading toward the open land where the mesa waited, its silence a comfort and a promise. The price of compassion had been paid in silver coins. The cost was yet to be counted. The walk from the town square to May's homestead was a journey through a landscape of silence. The dust puffed up around their feet in little clouds, settling again behind them as if to erase their path. May led the way, her back straight, feeling the weight of their footsteps behind her as a tangible pressure. Calder walked with a slow, pained gait, his body still a map of his recent ordeal. Jesse stayed so close to his father's side that he was almost a shadow, his small hand clutching a fold of Calder's torn trousers. No one spoke. The silence was a language of its own, thick with uncertainty, fear, and a fragile, unspoken question. What now? When they arrived, the homestead looked small and vulnerable under the vast, empty sky. A simple cabin, a lean-to for the mule, a chicken coop, and a patch of fenced-in garden. It was a world away from the wild mountains Calder and Jesse knew, and a universe away from the crowded, judgmental streets of Ash Creek. May stopped by the water pump. "I will get some fresh water. You can sit on the porch." Her voice was steady, practical. She did not look at them as she spoke, instead focusing on the rhythmic creak of the pump handle. Calder did not sit. His gaze swept over the small property, his one good eye taking in every detail. He saw the way the wind had worried a section of the porch roof, loosening the shingles. He saw the gate on the chicken coop hanging from a single leather hinge, and he saw the fence around her small corn patch. It was a flimsy thing, made of woven branches and hope, and in one corner, it had collapsed, leaving her meager crop vulnerable to deer or stray cattle. Without a word, he walked over to the broken section. He tested one of the support posts, found it rotten at the base, and pulled it from the dry earth with a soft grunt of effort. Jesse watched him, his small face a mask of anxiety. He did not understand this place, this woman, this sudden, shocking shift in their lives. He only understood his father, and his father was now working in a stranger's yard. May came back from the pump with a bucket of clear, cool water. She saw Calder by the fence, his broad back bent to the task. She set the bucket down and watched for a moment. She could have told him to rest. She could have said the fence could wait. But she understood. This was his answer. This was his way of speaking. It was a language of action, not of words. She learned, in that instant, to trust in a silence that knew how to work. She turned to the boy. "Jesse," she said softly. He flinched, as if the sound of his own name was a surprise. "Would you like to see if the hens have laid any eggs for us? There is a basket inside the door." He looked from her to his father. Calder gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the permission the boy needed. He scurried into the cabin and emerged a moment later with a small wicker basket, his mission giving him a sense of purpose that momentarily eclipsed his fear. Inside, May moved with the familiar economy of a woman who runs a household alone. She stirred the embers in her cast-iron stove, added a few sticks of juniper, and soon had a small, efficient fire going. She put a pot of beans on to boil, the smell of them slowly filling the small space. Dust motes danced in the shafts of late-afternoon sun slanting through the single window. She worked, and she listened. She heard the solid thud of a new post being driven into the ground. She heard the soft clucking of the hens as Jesse carefully searched their nesting boxes. These were the sounds of a life being lived, not just endured, for the first time in a very long time. Her small homestead did not feel empty. It felt occupied. When the sun began to dip toward the mesa, Calder had finished his work. The fence was not just repaired. It was stronger than it had been before. He had found a pile of discarded lumber behind the lean-to and fashioned new, solid posts, lashing them together with strips of leather he cut from his own worn boots. Jesse returned with 4 brown eggs, holding the basket out to May as if it were a precious treasure. His face was smudged with dirt, but his eyes held a flicker of pride. May took the eggs with a genuine smile. "Thank you. Jesse, this is a fine supper you have brought us." She cracked the eggs into a pan with some bacon fat, and soon the cabin was filled with the rich, comforting smells of sizzling bacon, boiling beans, and wood smoke. She set 3 bowls on the rough-hewn table. The silence at the table was different from the silence on the walk. It was a silence of shared labor and profound exhaustion. They ate without speaking, the scrape of their spoons against the ceramic bowls the only sound. May watched Calder. He ate like a man who had not known a warm meal in a long time, his movements efficient and focused. But when he thought she was not looking, his gaze would drift around the small cabin, taking in the neatly stacked shelves, the clean swept floor, the mended quilt on her narrow bed. After they had eaten, May took a clean rag and a bowl of warm water. She gestured to Calder's bruised face. "Let me," she said simply. It was not a question. He hesitated for only a moment before giving a stiff nod. She gently cleaned the cuts on his cheek and forehead. Her touch was light, clinical, but it was the first gentle human touch he had felt in a very long time. He closed his good eye, a muscle working in his jaw. When she was finished, she left a clean bandage and a small jar of salve on the table beside him. She made a bed for them on the floor near the hearth, laying out her thickest blankets. "Sleep here," she said. "It is the warmest spot." She retreated to her own bed without another word, turning her back to them to grant them a measure of privacy. Long into the night, she lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sound of two other people breathing in her home. It was a sound that both terrified and comforted her. A few days later, their supplies began to run low. The journey back into Ash Creek was a necessity she could not avoid. She hitched the mule, her stomach tightening with a familiar knot of dread. Calder came out of the lean-to, where he had been methodically reorganizing her tools. "I will go," he said. It was the first time he had offered a complete sentence. "No," she replied, shaking her head. "They will not sell to you, and they will only make more trouble. I have to go." He did not argue, but a look of deep frustration crossed his face. He hated this helplessness, this reliance on the courage of a pregnant woman who had bought him like a stray dog. The town was just as she had expected. Worse, even. As she walked toward the general store, a group of women who had once offered her polite, if cool, greetings, now turned their backs on her in a silent, coordinated gesture of contempt. Inside the store, the owner looked at her as if she were tracking mud on his clean floor. "We do not have what you need," he said, his voice flat. May looked at the shelves, which were fully stocked. "I just need flour and coffee." "We are out of flour and coffee." His eyes were cold, daring her to challenge him. A lie, and they both knew it. May felt a flush of anger, but she held her tongue. Arguing would do no good. As she turned to leave, a voice, loud enough for the whole store to hear, cut through the silence. "Imagine taking in that filthy creature. She is no better than an animal herself." May's shoulders stiffened, but she did not turn around. She walked out of the store, her head held high, and blinking back the hot tears that threatened to fall. Her humiliation was a public spectacle. As she was untying her mule, a stooped figure approached her. It was Hannah Pike, the midwife. The old woman's face was a nest of wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp and clear. "They are fools." "Child," she said, her voice a low rasp. "Fear makes people stupid and cruel." She pressed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle into May's hand. "Here, some herbs for a tea. It will help with the swelling in your ankles, and it will give the babe strength." May looked down at the bundle, overwhelmed by this small, unexpected act of kindness. "Thank you." "Hannah." The old woman patted her arm, her touch surprisingly strong. "You have a good heart, May Collins. Do not let this town poison it. You just mind yourself. That Rourke is a snake, and he will not forget what you did." May nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She watched the old woman walk away, a lone figure of decency in a town that had lost its way. The trip back to the homestead was somber, but when she arrived, she saw something that lifted her spirits. In the yard, Jessie was chasing one of the hens, a gangly creature that was always escaping the coop. The boy was laughing. It was not a loud laugh, but a series of small, breathless giggles, a rusty sound, as if it had been locked away for a very long time. Calder was leaning against the newly repaired fence, watching his son. And for the first time, May saw the ghost of a smile on his face. The sight was like a balm on the fresh wound of her morning's experience. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch, a comfortable silence settled between them. The sun was setting, and the mesa was on fire. May watched Calder's hands as he whittled a piece of wood. They were large, capable hands, scarred and calloused, but his movements were precise and gentle. He was carving a small bird for Jessie. Their eyes met for a moment across the twilight, and a current passed between them. an unspoken acknowledgement of the small pockets of peace they were building together in a world that wished them ill. The next morning, as May went to the well to draw water, she noticed something unusual in the dust. A set of footprints. They were not her own, nor were they the heavy, worn-down prints of Calder's boots. These were different. They were made by a softer shoe, a moccasin perhaps, and the person who made them walked with a light, fluid grace. They led from the edge of her property to the well, and then back into the scrub brush, disappearing as silently as they had come. A shiver of unease went through her. They were being watched. She said nothing to Calder, not wanting to alarm him, but the following dawn, she found something else. Hanging from a post on the new section of fence was a small bundle of dried grasses and leaves, tied together with a strip of sinew. It was placed deliberately, a clear and intentional offering. She took it down and brought it into the cabin. When Calder saw it, he stopped what he was doing. He took the bundle from her, his movement slow and reverent. He brought it to his nose, inhaling the scent of sage and sweetgrass. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his good eye. Relief, memory, hope. He looked at May, and his voice was low. "Chayton," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. A friend. The offering was a greeting, a sign. It meant they were not entirely alone. It was a promise, whispered on the dry wind, that in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, an old debt had not been forgotten. The bundle of dried herbs sat on the cabin's small mantelpiece, a silent testament to a world that existed just beyond the edges of Ash Creek. Its scent, a mix of sage and something wilder and sweeter, was a constant, subtle presence. For Calder, it was the smell of a debt repaid, a sign that the bonds forged in the high mountains had not been broken by fire or iron bars. For May, it was a reminder that they were being watched, not by the hostile eyes of the town, but by a gaze that was patient, knowing, and unseen. A fragile hope had taken root in the dry soil of their lives, but beneath it, the tension remained, a low hum of unease. That unease followed May into town a week later. She had a blade on her hoe that needed sharpening, a task that required the blacksmith, a man who traded in fire and steel, and cared little for town gossip as long as a customer's coin was good. As she waited for him to finish, she saw Silas Rourke and Mayor Vale emerge from the mayor's office. They did not see her. They stood on the boardwalk, their voices low and urgent. Vale, a man whose ambition had long ago outpaced his courage, was sweating in the shade, constantly dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. Rourke was a picture of predatory calm. "The railroad syndicate is not a patient partner." "Silas," the mayor said, his voice thin with anxiety. "They have guarantees." "And I will deliver," Rourke replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I have acquired every parcel I need, save one, the Collins woman. Her plot is the linchpin. It connects my northern pasture directly to the proposed spur line. Without it, the entire cattle route is inefficient, almost worthless." Vale wrung his hands. "She will not sell. She has the deed, free and clear. There is nothing I can do legally." "Legality is a matter of perspective." "Mayor." Rourke placed a heavy hand on Vale's shoulder. "You will find a way to condemn that land. Unsafe, unsanitary. A public nuisance. Find a reason. The town council will support you, because I will make it worth their while. You just need to sign the papers. The railroad brings progress, and progress has a price. I am willing to pay it. Are you willing to collect?" He gave the mayor a final, meaningful squeeze and walked away, leaving the smaller man looking pale and sick. May slipped away from the blacksmith's forge, her sharpened hoe blade suddenly feeling as heavy as an axe. It was not just about a grudge anymore. It was about a line of steel, about a river of cattle, and her small homestead was a rock in the middle of a current that was powerful enough to wash away mountains. The quiet days that followed felt like the calm before a storm. Calder worked tirelessly, reinforcing the lean-to, digging a new irrigation ditch from the well to her garden. He worked to keep the memories at bay, to build something solid that could not be turned to ash. Jesse, in turn, began to emerge from his shell of silence. He followed May as she fed the chickens, his small voice a soft echo as he counted the eggs. He had even started to smile, a quick, shy flash of light that transformed his haunted face. They were a strange and fractured family, but for moments at a time, under the patient gaze of the red mesa, they felt whole. The warning, when it came, shattered that fragile peace. It came late in the night, long after the moon had risen. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the soft sigh of the wind. May was asleep, a deep and heavy sleep brought on by the demands of her growing child. A sudden sharp crack ripped through the night, a sound that was not thunder. It was followed by the splintering of wood. May sat bolt upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her first instinct was a fierce, primal urge to protect the life inside her, her hands flying to her belly. Jesse let out a terrified cry from his blankets by the hearth. In the darkness, Calder moved with a speed and silence that was startling. He was not the slow, wounded man from the town square. He was a predator, a protector. In an instant, he was across the room, pulling Jesse behind him and pushing May toward the floor, away from the window. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice a low growl. Another shot rang out, closer this time. It thudded into the thick log wall of the cabin, the impact vibrating through the floor. They were not trying to hit them. Not yet. They were sending a message. This was Rourke's answer to her defiance. Calder crept to the window, peering out from the edge of the frame. He could see them. 2 riders, just shadows against the moonlight at the far edge of the property. They raised their rifles one more time, and a gout of flame erupted from a barrel, the bullet whining past the cabin and slamming into the side of the small barn. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they spurred their horses and vanished into the darkness. Silence rushed back in, deeper and more menacing than before. May could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. Jesse was sobbing quietly, his small body shaking. Calder remained at the window for a long time, a statue carved from rage and fear. May saw the set of his jaw, the hard line of his shoulders. She saw more than just a man protecting a home. She saw a man staring into the face of a ghost. The smell of gunpowder on the night air was too much like the smell of smoke. The splintering wood was too much like the roar of a fire. The past was not just a memory. It was a living thing, and it had found him again. The next morning, the sun rose on a world that felt fundamentally changed. The bullet holes in the cabin and barn were like wounds, stark evidence of the violence that lay coiled just beyond their fence. They did not speak of it. There were no words for the cold dread that had settled in the cabin with the morning light. He came as the sun was climbing toward its zenith, a lone figure on foot, appearing from the direction of the mesa. He did not approach the cabin directly, but stood at the edge of the property, a still, patient silhouette against the shimmering heat. Calder saw him first. He was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound in the tense morning. He stopped mid-swing, the axe held motionless in the air. His whole body went rigid. He stared at the figure for a long moment, and then a slow, profound change came over his face. The tension eased from his shoulders. He set the axe down and began to walk toward the man. It was Chayton Greyhawk. He was a man who seemed to be made of the land itself, his buckskin clothing the color of the dry earth, his long black hair stirred by the same wind that bent the junipers. His face was calm, his eyes holding the deep, quiet wisdom of a man who listens more than he speaks. They met at the fence line, not with a handshake, but with a long, silent look of understanding. A whole history passed between them in that gaze, a steel trap in the snow, a shared fire in a blizzard, a life given and a life saved. "The bear trap left a deep scar," Calder said, his voice rough. Chayton nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It reminds my leg to be more careful than my eyes. You have found trouble, my friend. It follows you like a shadow." It was not a question. Chayton's gaze swept over the fresh bullet holes in the barn. "It has a smell," he said, "greed and iron." He followed Calder back to the cabin. Jessie, who had been watching from the porch, hid behind May as the stranger approached. May stood her ground, her hand resting on the boy's shoulder, her expression wary but not hostile. "This is Chayton," Calder said. "By way of introduction, he is a friend." May nodded. "I saw your signs, and your gift." She gestured toward the mantelpiece. Chayton's eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw an ancient sadness mixed with an unbreakable strength. The herbs are a small thing. The land is sick. It is boiling with the fever of the railroad. They are laying down tracks of steel that cut the earth's veins. They want this land, all of it. He looked at Calder. To them, a free man in the mountains is a threat. A family on a small piece of ground is an obstacle. They will not ask you to move. They will burn you out to clear the way. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Burn! Calder's face became a mask of stone. May felt a chill go through her despite the heat. They went inside the cabin, the three of them, and sat at the small table. The air was thick with unspoken fears and the gravity of their situation. Chayton unrolled a piece of tanned deerskin onto the table. It was a map, but not like any May had ever seen. There were no straight lines or neat squares. Instead, there were the flowing contours of the land, the winding paths of creeks that were dry most of the year, the locations of hidden springs and sheltered canyons, all drawn in charcoal and berry juice. It was the land's own memory, recorded by a hand that knew its every secret. "My people have walked this ground since the first sunrise," Chayton said, his finger tracing a faint line that led up toward the mesa. "There are paths they do not know, places to hide, places to watch." Calder stared at the map, his mind seeing not just escape routes, but strategic positions. He slowly placed his large, scarred hand flat on the deerskin, covering a drawing of a hawk in flight. It was a pledge, a silent acceptance of a shared fight. His world of lonely survival had just intersected with a much older struggle. Watching them, May felt a shift inside herself. This was no longer just her fight for her home, or Calder's fight against his past. It was something larger. She stood up, went to a small chest where she kept her few possessions, and took out the simple folding knife her father had given her. Still wrapped in the oilcloth she kept it in. She walked back to the table and laid it down, next to Calder's hand and Chayton's map. The polished wood of the handle and the worn deerskin were a study in contrasts, but they represented the same thing: the will to endure. Her path, the path of a shamed woman from the east, had crossed with that of a broken man from the mountains and a Cheyenne warrior whose freedom was being erased. 3 lives, pushed to the edge. Now intertwined, they were outgunned, outnumbered, and standing on the last piece of ground that stood between a powerful man's greed and the inexorable advance of the railroad. And in the quiet of the small cabin, under the shadow of the red mesa, they made their silent pact to stand together. The days settled into a tense rhythm, a quiet underscored by the constant threat of violence. The bullet holes in the walls were a constant reminder, like open wounds that would not heal. The silence in the cabin deepened, but its nature had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers learning to trust one another. It was the shared silence of soldiers waiting for a battle. It was in this quiet that the past began to speak. Jesse sat on the top step of the porch, his small fingers tracing the contours of the wooden cross. The wood was smooth in some places, worn down by the constant touch of his hand, but rough and splintered in others. One of the arms was blackened, the grain of the pine permanently darkened by a heat that had nearly consumed it. As his thumb brushed over the charred wood, the world of the sun-drenched porch dissolved, and he was back in the fire. It wasn't a memory of thought, but of feeling. The heat was a living thing, a roaring beast that ate the air and turned the world orange and black. He remembered the smell of burning pitch from the cabin walls, a smell that had filled his nose and lungs until he could taste it. He remembered the sound, a terrible, hungry roar that drowned out everything else. He was small, wrapped in a blanket in his small bed, and the world was ending. Then, hands, his father's hands, strong and sure, pulling him from the heat. He was lifted up, his face pressed into the rough wool of his father's shirt. Calder was moving, not running, but wading through an ocean of flame and smoke. The heat licked at them, and the air was thick with flying embers that glowed like angry fireflies. They burst through the doorway, out of the roaring mouth of the cabin and into the cold night air. For a moment, they were not alone. Another man was there, a shadow against the blazing cabin. His face twisted in the flickering light. He had been turning to leave, but Calder's sudden exit surprised him. They collided, a tangle of limbs and momentum. Jesse, held tight against his father's chest, saw the man's face up close for just a split second. He saw the surprise in his eyes, and something else, on the man's shoulder where his shirt was torn. A mark, a strange, jagged shape seared into the skin, dark against the firelight. Then the man shoved them away and vanished into the darkness, a fleeting ghost born of the flames. The memory shattered, and Jesse was back on the porch, the sun warm on his face, the wooden cross clutched in his hand. He did not understand what he had seen. It was just another piece of the nightmare, a jumble of heat and fear and a strange, dark shape on a stranger's skin. May watched him from the doorway, her heart aching for the boy who carried a burden too heavy for his small shoulders. She had seen him like this before, lost in a world she could not enter. His only anchor, the piece of charred wood he never let go of. She rested a hand on her own belly, feeling the gentle, insistent kick of the new life within her. A fierce, protective wave washed over her, a feeling so powerful it almost took her breath away. She thought of the family who had cast her out, of the town that scorned her, of the powerful man who wanted to erase her from the landscape. They all saw her as weak, a fallen woman, a problem to be solved or removed. They did not see the iron core of will that had carried her this far. She made a silent promise to the child who was yet to be born, a vow spoken not with her lips but with every fiber of her being. I will not bow my head again, not for them, not for anyone. This home is ours, this family, this strange, broken family brought together by chance and cruelty, is mine, and I will not let them take it from us. That afternoon, Chayton performed a small ceremony. It was not a grand or mystical affair. It was practical, rooted in the deep, earthbound knowledge of his people. He built a small fire in a clearing a little ways from the cabin, using dry sticks that would produce very little smoke. He then laid a thick bundle of dried sage onto the hot embers. A thick, aromatic white smoke began to rise, fragrant and clean. The wind carries more than dust, he explained to May and Calder as they watched. It carries the scent of man, of mule, of chickens. It tells a story to anyone who knows how to read it. Rourke's men are hunters of a kind. They will be watching, listening, smelling. Today, we will make our story difficult to read. He took a smoldering branch of the sage and began to walk the perimeter of the homestead. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, letting the smoke drift and curl in the air, a fragrant curtain that settled over the fence posts, the chicken coop, the roof of the cabin. He was not praying to spirits. He was erasing their presence from the air, cleansing the land of their scent and replacing it with the ancient, wild smell of sage. He was using the wind's own language to lie, to create a pocket of anonymity in a land where they were being hunted. When he was finished, a peaceful, clean scent hung over the homestead, a stark contrast to the tension that still coiled in their hearts. Chayton looked toward the distant hills where Rourke's riders had disappeared. They left a careless trail, he said. His eyes narrowed. The tracks of shod horses are heavy and deep. They tell you where they have been. Sometimes, they tell you where they will go. I will go and read their story. He would be gone for a day, perhaps 2. The wait was a quiet agony. Calder grew more silent than ever, his watchful presence a constant, brooding weight. He spent the time checking the rifle he had managed to keep, cleaning and oiling it with a focused intensity that spoke of his inner turmoil. May tried to maintain a routine, for Jessie's sake and for her own. She baked bread, mended a shirt, weeded the garden, her simple, domestic tasks a small rebellion against the chaos that threatened to engulf them. Chayton returned at dusk on the second day. He walked out of the twilight, as silent as a shadow, his face grim. He carried something heavy, wrapped in a piece of burlap. He did not speak until they were all inside the cabin, the door barred, the single lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. He placed the bundle on the table. The sound was a solid, metallic thud, with slow, deliberate movements. He unwrapped it. Lying on the rough wood of the table was a branding iron. The iron was heavy, the handle worn smooth with use, but it was the head of the iron that drew their eyes. It was a stylized design, an S and an R, cunningly intertwined to form a single, unique mark. Silas Rourke. I followed their tracks, Chayton said, his voice low and even. They lead to a small canyon, a place with a cave and a hidden spring, a good place to hide men who do not wish to be seen. I watched them. I waited until they rode out this morning. In the ashes of their fire, they left this behind. They were careless, or arrogant. Calder stared at the branding iron, his face a bloodless mask. His breath hitched in his throat. The world seemed to fall away. The cabin, the lantern light, all of it gone. Replaced by the memory of fire and smoke. He saw the embers of his own burned-out home. The life he had built turned to black ash. And he remembered kicking something in the debris, something heavy and iron that had been left behind in the hasty flight of the arsonists. But it was Jessie who spoke, his small voice cutting through the thick silence. "The mark," he whispered, his eyes wide, fixed on the iron. He pointed a trembling finger at it. "The man in the fire. It was on him." May looked from the boy to Calder, her mind racing, not yet understanding. "What mark, Jessie?" "It was not a scar," Calder said, his voice a raw, broken thing, as if the words themselves were shards of glass. It was a brand. The memory, hazy and dreamlike for the boy, was now terribly, brutally clear for the father, the man who had set fire to his home, who had destroyed his life and taken his wife, had been one of Rourke's own men. This was not a new fight. It was the last, desperate chapter of an old one. The fire that had haunted Calder's past and the threat that shadowed their present were one and the same. And the man responsible had a name: Silas Rourke. The branding iron on the table was more than just a piece of evidence. It was a declaration of war. The wind changed after sundown. It had been a hot, still day, the air thick and heavy. But as darkness settled over the plains, a new current began to move. It came from the east, a cool and restless breath of air that whispered through the dry grass and rattled the loose shingle on May's porch roof. It was the kind of wind that carries change, a harbinger of storms. Inside the cabin, the branding iron lay on the table, a cold, dark accusation in the lantern light. No one had moved it. It was a snake in their house, its poison the truth they now all shared. May sat at the table, her hands folded over her belly, a silent statue of resolve. Jessie was asleep on his blankets, his face peaceful for the first time in days. Calder stood by the window, watching the darkness, his body a tight coil of energy. And Chayton sat near the door, sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the soft, rhythmic scrape the only sound in the suffocating quiet. It was Chayton who heard it first. He stopped the motion of his hand, his head tilted, listening to something beyond the sound of the wind, a low, distant murmur, the sound of many hoofbeats, many boots on dry ground. "They are coming," he said, his voice a calm statement of fact. Calder did not turn from the window. He had been expecting them. He had been waiting for this fire his entire life since the last one. On the horizon, a single point of light appeared, then another and another, a scattered constellation of orange stars, growing brighter as they drew closer. Torches. "Rourke is not a subtle man," Calder said, his voice a low rumble. "He wants a spectacle." Chayton rose, his movements fluid and unhurried. He went to the water bucket and picked up May's largest shovel, the one with the sharpened blade she used for cutting roots. He looked at Calder. "The fire will be their weapon. We must fight it first." May got up and began to move with a clear, determined purpose. She pulled the heavy wooden table away from the wall and dragged it to the center of the room. "Jesse," she said softly, waking the boy. "Come behind here with me. Jesse!" His eyes wide with a sleep-dazed fear, scrambled behind the makeshift barricade without a word. May pulled her thickest quilt from the bed and draped it over the table, creating a small, protected den. The murmur outside had grown into a low roar, the sound of an angry crowd. The torchlight washed the homestead in a flickering, hellish glow. A voice, amplified by rage and authority, rose above the others. Silas Rourke. "May Collins," he bellowed, "you have been given every chance to be a decent member of this community. Instead, you harbor a wild animal, a fugitive from justice. You have brought the filth of his pagan friend into this valley. You have until the count of 10 to send them out, or we will burn this nest of sin to the ground." The threat hung in the air, thick and choking as smoke. Calder moved away from the window, pulling his rifle from its pegs on the wall. He checked the load, his movements economical and precise. He had 6 shots. He looked at May, his one good eye conveying a world of regret and resolve. "Do not be afraid," he said. May met his gaze, and in her eyes there was no fear, only a cold, hard anger. "I stopped being afraid a long time ago." The crowd began to count, their voices a drunken, ugly chorus. 1, 2, 3. Chayton was already outside, a shadow moving in the darkness beyond the ring of torchlight. He did not move toward the mob. He moved toward the well, the shovel in his hand. 4, 5. Calder took his position near the window, the long barrel of his rifle resting on the sill. He was not aiming at the men. He was watching their hands, watching for the first man to throw a torch. 6, 7. Chayton worked with a desperate, focused energy. He began to dig, not a deep trench, but a shallow scrape in the hard-packed earth. A wide circle around the cabin, kicking the loose dirt away. He was making a fire break, a desperate gamble against a coming tide of flame. 8, 9. Before they could shout 10, the first torch flew through the air, a burning comet trailing sparks. It landed on the roof of the small barn with a soft whoosh. The dry, weathered wood caught instantly. Orange flames began to lick at the edges of the roof. The first shot from the cabin was not aimed at a man, but at the torch in another man's hand. The bullet splintered the wood, sending the burning brand spinning harmlessly into the dirt. The crowd, startled, fell silent for a moment. Then an angry roar went up, and 3 more shots answered from the darkness, thudding into the log walls of the cabin. Outside, Chayton ran to the well, dropped the bucket, and hauled it up, his muscles straining. He sloshed the precious water on the ground near the cabin wall, creating a patch of dark, damp earth. It was a pitiful defense, but it was all he had. The barn was now fully engulfed, the flames roaring into the night sky, illuminating the scene in a terrifying, dancing light. The panicked sounds of the mule and the chickens added to the chaos. Calder fired again, this time at the feet of a man who was about to throw another torch. The man yelped and jumped back. his courage failing him. 4 shots left. A figure detached from the main mob and circled around the side, moving through the shadows. Chaitin saw him, a big man with a long knife. Chaitin dropped his bucket and met the man's charge, the shovel held like a weapon. They came together in a grunting, shadowy struggle. The knife flashed. Chaitin twisted away, the blade slicing across his arm. But he brought the flat of the shovel up hard under the man's chin. The man went down with a sickening crack. Inside, Calder saw another man take aim at the window. He pulled back just as a bullet ripped through the space where his head had been, shattering a ceramic pitcher on May's shelf. 3 shots left. "Stay down, May!" he yelled, as she peered over the edge of the table. Another bullet slammed into the tabletop, the heavy oak groaning with the impact. A long, sharp splinter flew through the air, and May cried out, not in pain, but in shock. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the roar of the fire and the crack of rifles. It was the sound of a voice, a woman's voice, sharp and commanding and utterly without fear. "Jedediah Smith, you put that rifle down." The shooting stopped. The mob, confused, turned to see 2 figures walking into the firelight. It was Hannah Pike, her face grim and set as stone, and beside her, the tall, black-clad figure of Reverend Cole. Hannah walked right up to the line of men, her gaze sweeping over them, seeing not a faceless mob, but the husbands and sons she had known her entire life. She pointed a bony finger at a man near the front. "Jedediah Smith, I sat with your wife for 2 days while she brought your son into this world. That boy would have died if not for me. Is this how you thank God for that life by trying to take another?" She turned to another man. "Thomas Miller, your daughter had the fever. I pulled her back from the brink. You told me you owed me a debt you could never repay. I am calling in that debt tonight. You will go home. Now." Reverend Cole stepped forward, his Bible held not as a weapon, but as a shield. He did not shout. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of divine authority. "The Lord says, 'Vengeance is mine.' He did not say it belongs to Silas Rourke. He says, 'Thou shalt not kill.' He did not make an exception for men you call beasts. He says, 'Shelter the weak.' And there is no one weaker than a woman about to give birth, and a fatherless child. Look at your hands. Look at the torches you carry. Is this the work of God, or is this the work of a man who values his cattle more than your souls?" A wave of shame and uncertainty rippled through the crowd. Men began to look at each other, then at the ground. They were farmers and blacksmiths and storekeepers, not murderers. Rourke's righteous anger had curdled into something ugly and mean in the face of the town's 2 moral pillars. Rourke saw his control slipping. He spurred his horse forward, his face a mask of fury. "They are harboring criminals. They have brought paganism into our midst." He pointed a shaking finger at Chaitin, who stood bleeding silently by the well. Just then, a rider from the far side, one of Rourke's hired guns who had not heard the Reverend, took a final, desperate shot at the cabin. Calder saw him and moved to intercept, but he was too slow. The bullet tore through the air, heading straight for the flimsy door where May was now standing. Calder threw himself forward, a cry torn from his throat. He felt a searing, white-hot pain in his shoulder as the bullet grazed him, but he was not the target. May, with a strength born of pure instinct, had grabbed the heavy, unhinged cabin door and was pulling it shut as the shot was fired. The bullet, meant for her heart, slammed into the thick wood of the door, burying itself just inches from her face. The world seemed to hold its breath. The moment was broken by a small figure running from behind the table. It was Jesse. He did not run toward his father or May. He ran toward the burning barn, toward the inferno. "Jesse, no!" Calder screamed, his voice raw with terror. But the boy was deaf to him. He ran to the edge of the flames, to the collapsed front of the barn where a small pile of his father's belongings, rescued from the first fire, had been stored. He reached into the smoldering pile of debris and pulled out his small, charred wooden cross. He clutched it to his chest and ran back, his face streaked with soot and tears. That image of his small son running through the fire to save the last relic of their family broke something inside Calder. The dam of his silence, built of grief and shame and rage, finally burst. He stood up, ignoring the burning pain in his shoulder, and faced the stunned crowd. "Fire," he said, his voice rusty and cracked, but carrying across the stunned silence. "You want to talk about fire?" He pointed a trembling finger at Silas Rourke. "Ask him about the fire that took my wife. Ask him about the night my home was burned to the ground, my wife inside, because I would not sell him my land." He took a stumbling step forward, his eyes burning with a feverish light. "My son saw one of his men that night, a man with Rourke's brand on his shoulder. This is not about justice. This has never been about justice. This is about a line on a map. It is about a cattle trail for a railroad. He wants this land, and he will burn anyone who stands in his way. He already has." The accusation, so long held in the silent chambers of his heart, was now free. It hung in the air, more powerful than the heat of the flames, more damning than the word of any preacher. The crowd looked from Calder's tormented face to Rourke's, and for the first time, they saw the truth. As if on cue, a single drop of rain fell, hissing on the hot barrel of a dropped rifle. Then another, and another. A sudden, cool shower began to fall from the dark sky, turning into a downpour. The rain hissed against the embers of the barn, sending up clouds of steam. It washed the soot from the air and the blood from Chayton's arm. The mob, their fiery rage extinguished, began to melt away, men slinking back into the darkness, their torches sputtering and dying in the sudden, cleansing storm. Soon, only a handful of people remained in the muddy, fire-scarred yard: a wounded father, a brave woman, a terrified child, a bleeding warrior, a midwife, and a preacher, all standing together in the ruins, under the healing rain. The morning after the fire was unnaturally quiet. The rain had passed, leaving behind a clean, cold sky and a world washed in shades of gray. The ground in the town square was a sea of mud, and the air was thick with the smell of wet ash and collective shame. People gathered, not in a boisterous mob as they had for the auction, but in small, silent clusters, their faces pale and drawn in the morning light. They stood with their heads bowed, avoiding each other's eyes. The memory of their torch lit fury, a sour taste in their mouths. At the center of the square, in front of the mayor's office, stood a small group. Reverend Cole, his black coat spattered with mud. Hannah Pike, her wrinkled face set in a grim, unyielding expression. And between them, the hired gun Chayton had disabled, his arm in a crude sling, his face a mask of pain and fear. Mayor Vale stood on the boardwalk in front of them, looking not like a man in charge, but like a cornered animal, on a barrel that had been rolled into the center of the square for all to see, lay the Rourke branding iron. It sat there, dark and heavy, an irrefutable fact. Reverend Cole's voice, though not loud, carried across the unnerving silence. "This man has confessed. Mayor, he was paid by Silas Rourke, along with the others. Paid to intimidate, paid to threaten, and paid, if necessary, to burn." The hired gun, whose name was Frank, looked at the crowd with terrified eyes. "He paid us, it is true," he mumbled, his voice cracking. "Said the mountain man was a squatter and the woman was a troublemaker. Said the town wanted them gone. We were just following orders." He looked at Vale, a desperate plea in his eyes. Mayor Vale mopped his brow with a trembling hand. He opened his mouth to speak, to bluster, to deny, but no words came. His authority had crumbled in the night, washed away by the rain and the truth. It was then that another small group approached, walking through the mud from the edge of town, May with Calder at her side. Chayton walked a few paces behind them, a silent, watchful guardian. Calder's arm was bandaged, and he moved stiffly, but he walked with his head held high. Jesse held his father's hand, his small face etched with a weariness that did not belong to a child. May stopped before the barrel, before the mayor, before the entire silent town. She did not look at Rourke's iron. She looked at the faces in the crowd. She saw the women who had turned their backs on her, the men who had laughed at her expense, the people who had been ready to watch her home burn. There was no hatred in her eyes, only a profound and weary sadness. She rested a hand on her belly, a simple, protective gesture that was more eloquent than any speech. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The entire town was listening. "My name is May Collins," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Before I came here, I had a family. In the East, they had a fine house, and they went to church every Sunday. When they learned I was with child, without a husband, they sent me away. They told me I had brought shame upon them, and that I was no longer their daughter. They cast me out." She paused, letting the simple, brutal truth of her words settle over the crowd. "I came west because I heard it was a place where a person could start over, where what you could do with your hands mattered more than the name of your father. I wanted nothing more than a small piece of ground and a roof to keep my baby safe. I built my home with my own 2 hands. I have never asked for anything from any of you. I have only asked to be left alone." Her gaze moved from face to face, and this time, people did not look away. They met her eyes, and they saw not the fallen woman they had imagined, but a woman of incredible strength. "You judged me from the moment I arrived, just as you judged him." She gestured toward Calder. "You called him a beast because he was silent and lived in the mountains. You called me a sinner because I was alone and with child. You never tried to know us. You only listened to your own fear. Last night, you brought fire to my home. You were ready to burn a pregnant woman and a small boy out of your lives because you were told to. I am not asking for your pity. I am asking for justice, for my child, for a home that will not be turned to ash, for the right to live in peace." A sound broke the silence, a soft, choked sob. It came from a woman in a gingham dress, the wife of Jedediah Smith. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Her sob was like a key turning in a lock. Another woman began to cry, then another. The sound of weeping spread through the square, a wave of grief and shame. It was the sound of a community's heart breaking open. It was the sound of a poison being drawn out. These were not tears of pity for May. They were tears for themselves, for the ugliness they had allowed to fester in their own souls. The men stared at their boots, their faces flushed with shame. They remembered the feel of the torches in their hands, the hateful shouts in their throats, and they were sickened. The woman in the gingham dress, Mrs. Smith, stepped forward. She walked to May, her face wet with tears. She could not speak. She reached into the basket she carried and pulled out a small loaf of freshly baked bread, still warm. She held it out to May, an offering, an apology, a plea for forgiveness. May took it, and for a moment, the 2 women just stood there, their hands clasped around the simple gift, in that small, silent gesture. A bridge was built across a chasm of prejudice, as this quiet, emotional reckoning was unfolding. A figure slipped from the shadows of the alley beside the saloon. Silas Rourke had been watching, his face a thundercloud of disbelief. He had lost his power, built on fear and intimidation, had evaporated in the clear light of morning. He saw the sheriff, who had always been so eager to do his bidding, now standing with Reverend Cole, his face grim. There would be no help for him here. His only option was to run. He moved quickly, keeping to the back of the buildings, making his way to the livery stable where his fastest horse was kept. He was a man accustomed to others doing his fighting for him. His own courage was a shallow, brittle thing. He had the horse saddled and was leading it out the back door when 2 figures blocked his path. Calder and Chayton stood there, waiting for him. They had not been in the square for May's speech. They had known where Rourke would go. Rourke's face went pale. He dropped the reins and fumbled for the pistol at his hip. He was not fast. Before his fingers could close around the handle, Chayton moved. He was a blur of motion, a striking snake. He knocked the gun from Rourke's hand and sent him stumbling back against the stable wall. Rourke looked from Chayton's cold, unforgiving eyes to Calder's. In Calder's face, he saw the reflection of a burning cabin, the memory of a woman's life turned to ash. This was it. This was the vengeance he had been running from. "Please," he whimpered, all his bluster gone. It was business, just business. Calder looked at the pathetic, trembling man before him, and he felt nothing. The burning hatred that had consumed him for so long had been quenched by the rain, by the truth, by the simple courage of the woman who had saved him. Vengeance would not bring his wife back. It would only make him a monster like the man he despised. He took a length of rope from a hook on the wall. He did not speak. He simply walked up to Rourke and began to tie his hands behind his back, his movements sure and steady. The irony was a palpable thing. The man who had been put in chains was now the one tying the knots. The man who had been sold on an auction block was now the agent of a justice that could not be bought. They led him back to the square. A prisoner with a rope around his wrists instead of shackles, they pushed him through the stunned, silent crowd and brought him before the mayor. The sight of their powerful landlord, now humbled and captive, was the final, undeniable proof of the town's collective sin. The sheriff, his face a mixture of relief and resolve, stepped forward. He took the rope from Calder's hand and officially took Silas Rourke into his custody. The rule of law, however fragile, had finally returned to Ash Creek. The tears in the square had subsided, replaced by a profound and solemn quiet. The town looked at May, at Calder, at Jesse, and at Chayton. They were no longer outcasts. They were survivors. They were a mirror in which the town could finally see its own reflection. And in the quiet aftermath of the storm, in the cleansing light of a new day, the slow, painful work of healing had begun. The sun rose on a world scrubbed clean. The air, crisp and cool after the rain, carried the scent of wet earth and pine, a stark contrast to the lingering smell of ash that clung to the burned-out skeleton of the barn. The silence that had fallen over the town square the day before had followed them home. It was a silence no longer born of fear or uncertainty, but of exhaustion and a deep, bone-weary peace. They had spent the morning in quiet labor. Calder, his shoulders stiff and aching, had salvaged what he could from the wreckage, his movements slow but methodical. May had swept the last of the broken ceramic from her floor, while Jesse, with a solemn focus, had gathered the chickens that had scattered during the chaos, his soft calls a gentle counterpoint to the quiet devastation. Around mid-morning, they heard the sound of a wagon, its wheels creaking in the damp air. May looked up, her hand instinctively going to the small knife in her apron pocket. Calder straightened from his work, his body tensing, a sentinel watching the approach. But it was not a threat that came down the muddy track. It was Jedediah Smith, the man Hannah Pike had shamed in front of the mob. He was not alone. Thomas Miller was with him, and two other men May recognized from the town. They stopped their wagon a respectful distance from the homestead, their hats held in their hands, their faces a mixture of shame and awkward resolve. "Mr. Boone, Miss Collins," Jedediah began, his voice rough. He could not quite meet their eyes. We came to help. If you will have us," he gestured to the back of his wagon, which was loaded with fresh-cut lumber and tools. "We figured we owed you more than just an apology." May and Calder exchanged a look. It was a gesture so profound, so unexpected, that for a moment neither of them knew what to say. The same hands that had held torches were now offering hammers. The work of rebuilding began. It was a strange and solemn affair. Words were few, but the air was thick with unspoken meaning. The rhythmic sound of hammers striking nails, of saws biting into fresh pine, became a new language. It was a language of atonement. The men of Ash Creek, who had come to destroy, now worked to create. They were not just building a barn. They were rebuilding their own honor, one plank at a time. Calder worked alongside them, his silence a thing they now understood. It was not the silence of a beast, but of a man who had suffered too much to have words left. They watched him, saw the easy strength in his arms, the builder's knowledge in his hands, and their fear was replaced by a grudging, then a genuine respect. Chayton was there too, moving between the men with a quiet efficiency, his presence a bridge between two worlds. He did not speak much, but when a rope was needed to hoist a beam, his knots were the surest. When a measurement was in doubt, his eye was the truest. By noon, more people had arrived. The women came, led by Mrs. Smith, their arms laden with baskets of food and jugs of cool water. They set up a makeshift table under the cottonwood tree, and the smell of roasting chicken and fresh bread mingled with the scent of sawdust. They did not intrude on May's cabin, but their presence was a warm and comforting circle around the homestead. Hannah Pike came, and she brought with her a thick, heavy woolen blanket, woven in patterns of deep blue and forest green. She pressed it into May's hands. "Every home needs warmth," she said, her voice soft, "and every soul needs to know it is not alone. This blanket holds the prayers of a dozen women who are sorry for their fear." May held the heavy blanket, its weight a tangible comfort. It felt like an embrace, a promise from the community that had once cast her out. Jesse was not hiding. He moved through the bustle of the work site like a small, important sprite, carrying pegs to the men, bringing cups of water to his father. He was a part of the rebuilding, a small, essential piece of the healing. By the end of the day, a new frame stood where the old barn had been, its raw, yellow pine a testament to the day's labor. As the men packed their tools and began to leave, they stopped, one by one, to nod at Calder. It was not a gesture of equals, not yet, but it was a beginning. It was an acknowledgement. That evening, as the last of the twilight faded from the sky and the new frame of the barn stood as a dark skeleton against the stars, Chayton sat with May and Calder on the porch. The air was cool, and May had the new woolen blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "My work here is finished," Chayton said, his gaze fixed on the distant silhouette of the mesa. He had cleaned and bound his arm, and his movements were once again fluid and graceful. "You are leaving?" May asked, a note of sadness in her voice. "My people are gathering. The railroad is pushing farther west. The buffalo are few. The old ways are fighting for their last breath. It is my place to be with them, to listen to the elders, to teach the young." He turned his gaze to Calder. "Freedom is not the right to live without rules. My friend, it is the responsibility to live by the right ones, to protect your family, to honor the land, to be a man of your word. You have found your responsibility here. And you will not return." Calder's voice was low, heavy with the thought of losing the only true friend he had ever known. Chayton smiled. "A rare and beautiful thing. The hawk does not forget the mountain where it learned to fly. If the wind carries your voice to me, I will hear it, and I will come." He stood and placed a hand for a moment on Calder's good shoulder. Then he nodded to May, a gesture of profound respect. He turned and walked away from the small pool of lantern light, his figure melting into the darkness as silently as he had first appeared. Later that night, the cabin was filled with a deep and resonant quiet. Jesse was fast asleep, his face untroubled, his small hand still clutching the charred cross, which now rested on the blanket beside him, no longer a symbol of terror, but of survival. May sat at the table, the lantern casting a soft, golden glow on her face. Calder stood by the open door, looking out at the new structure that stood as a promise in the moonlight. He came back inside, his shoulder obviously paining him. He sat down heavily in the chair opposite her. May rose without a word and fetched the bowl of warm water and the clean rags. She came and stood beside him and began to gently unwrap the bandage on his shoulder. Her touch was light, her movements sure. The lantern light played on the concentration in her face, on the gentle curve of her brow. The silence in the room was a living thing. It was made of the scent of the sage Chayton had burned, the smell of fresh-cut pine that clung to Calder's clothes, and the deep, unspoken gratitude that flowed between them. They had been through the fire together, and it had burned away everything that was not essential. All that was left was this quiet, this trust. As May carefully cleaned the wound, her fingers brushed against the warm, solid skin of his back. He drew a sharp breath, but not from pain. She finished her work, tying a new, clean bandage in place. She did not move away. Her hand remained resting lightly on his shoulder. He reached up, his own hand, large and calloused and scarred, and covered hers. It was not a gesture of passion, but of a profound and elemental connection. It was a gesture that said, "You are safe. I am here. We are home." He turned his head, and his one good eye, so full of the pain and sorrow she had come to know, was now clear and calm, like a mountain lake after a storm. "May," he said, his voice a low whisper. It was the first time he had said her name with such tenderness, and it was a sound that seemed to fill every empty space inside her. She moved her other hand to his face, her thumb gently tracing the line of his jaw through his rough beard. She felt the tremor that went through him at her touch. In that moment, there were no more words to be said. Everything that needed to be understood was right here, in this small, quiet cabin, in the touch of a hand, in the shared breath of two souls who had found each other in the ruins. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing, a deep sigh escaping his lips, a sound of surrender, of peace, of a man who had finally, after a lifetime of running, come home. The lantern flame flickered, casting their shadows long against the wall. Two separate figures finally, irrevocably, becoming one. The next morning, May was on the porch, wrapped in the new woolen blanket, a cup of coffee warming her hands. The sun was just beginning to touch the top of the mesa, painting it in strokes of rose and gold. Calder was already out by the new barn, testing a beam, his movements no longer stiff with pain, but fluid with purpose. The cabin door opened, and Jesse came out. Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he saw May on the porch, and a small, natural smile touched his lips. He walked over to her, leaning against her legs, looking out at the new day. "Ma," he said, his voice soft and clear, "is there more coffee?" The simple, childish question, the simple, beautiful name, hung in the crisp morning air. Across the yard, Calder stopped his work. He had heard. He turned slowly, his face in shadow. He looked at the small boy leaning against the woman who had saved them both. He looked at May, at her face, which was alight with a sudden, brilliant joy. And then, for the first time, a true and genuine smile broke across Calder Boone's face. It was a smile that reached his eyes, that smoothed the hard lines of his past. A smile that was full of the promise of 1,000 mornings just like this one. A week after the fire, a circuit judge, a weary man whose face was a roadmap of long, dusty trails, arrived in Ash Creek. He did not convene a formal court in the saloon, as was often the custom. Instead, a temporary hearing was held in the open air of the town square, the same ground that had witnessed both the shame of the auction and the catharsis of the community's confession. Silas Rourke stood before the judge, no longer a powerful landowner, but a common prisoner, his hands bound. The branding iron lay on a table for all to see. A silent, damning witness, the hired gun. Frank, his arm still in a sling, gave his testimony, his voice a low, fearful mumble that was nonetheless clear in the morning quiet. He spoke of Rourke's orders, of the plan to acquire land for the railroad, and of the first fire, the one that had taken Calder's wife. He spoke of it as a job that had gone wrong, a simple act of intimidation that had turned into a tragedy. Calder was asked to speak. He stood before the judge, his voice low but steady, and told the story he had held inside for so long. He did not speak with anger, but with the flat, heavy finality of a man reciting a truth he had lived with every day. When he finished, a profound silence settled over the square. The story, now told in the clear light of day, was no longer a rumor or a wild accusation. It was a fact, as solid and immovable as the mesa that watched over them. The judge, a man who had seen the worst of what men could do for land and money, rendered his verdict quickly. The crimes of arson, conspiracy, and murder were beyond the scope of a local magistrate. Silas Rourke was to be bound over to the federal marshals and transported to Cheyenne for a full trial, as the sheriff led him away in chains to await the marshals. Rourke did not look at the crowd. His empire of fear had crumbled to dust, and he was just a man, stripped of everything but his guilt. His departure marked a turning point for Ash Creek. The fear he had cultivated for so long was gone, and in its place, something new began to grow. It started with a town meeting, led not by the humbled Mayor Vale, but by a council of ordinary citizens. Jedediah Smith, his face earnest and determined, stood up. "We were a mob," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction born of deep shame. "We were ready to follow one man's anger into the fire. That cannot happen again." His proposal was simple and practical. Every homestead would be required by town ordinance to maintain a fire break, a clear strip of land around their buildings. A public well would be dug at the center of the square, its sole purpose to provide water in case of a fire. And most importantly, a bell would be purchased. It would be hung in a small tower built by the hands of the townspeople, and its purpose would be singular. It would not ring for church services or for celebrations. It would ring only as a call to arms against a common enemy. Whether that enemy was a wildfire or the fire of mob rule, it would be an alarm, a reminder, a collective conscience cast in iron. A few weeks later, after the new barn at May's homestead was complete, Chayton returned. He did not come alone. He was accompanied by 2 elders from his tribe, their faces maps of dignity and time. They came not as warriors, but as ambassadors. May had sent word with a traveling trapper, extending an invitation. She met them in the square, with Reverend Cole at her side. She proposed her idea to the town council, who had gathered to meet the Cheyenne delegation. Ash Creek, she argued, could not survive as an island of fear. It needed neighbors. It needed trade. She proposed a monthly market day, where the Cheyenne could bring their tanned hides, their intricate beadwork, and their knowledge of medicinal herbs, to trade for things they needed from the town, like iron tools, woven blankets, and sacks of flour. There was a moment of hesitation. The old fears, the old prejudices, were a deep and stubborn root. But then Reverend Cole stepped forward. "Our Lord taught us to love our neighbors," he said, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his congregation. He did not put a condition on who that neighbor might be. "We have lived in the shadow of these mountains, but we have never known the people who call them home. We have been poor neighbors. It is time we learned to be good ones." The first market day was a tentative affair. The people of Ash Creek and the Cheyenne met in the square, a space that had been transformed from a place of judgment to a place of commerce and cautious curiosity. Chayton moved between the 2 groups, his calm presence a steadying influence, translating not just words, but intentions. A child from the town stared in wide-eyed wonder at the intricate pattern on a Cheyenne cradleboard. A Cheyenne elder examined the keen steel edge of a blacksmith's axe with a knowing eye. It was a small beginning, a single thread of connection in a tapestry that had been torn apart. At the end of the day, Reverend Cole asked everyone to gather. He stood before the mixed crowd of townspeople in Cheyenne, his Bible in his hand. He did not read from it. He spoke from his heart. "Let us offer a prayer," he said, his voice soft but clear. "A prayer of thanks. For the sun that warms us, for the rain that feeds the earth, for the lives we have been given. We thank the Creator, the Great Spirit, the God who has many names, but who speaks to all of us in the whisper of the wind and the silence of the stones. We pray for the souls of those who have been lost to fire and to fear, and we pray for the wisdom to live together in peace, to be guardians of this land that we share. Amen." On the homestead, a new kind of life took shape, built on the foundations of the new barn and the new peace. One afternoon, Calder took Jesse out to a small clearing, a good distance from the cabin. He carried his rifle. He set up a row of tin cans on a fallen log. "A man needs to know how to use one of these," he said, his voice quiet and serious as he showed Jesse how to hold the heavy rifle, how to brace it against his shoulder, but not to hunt for sport, and not to settle an argument. A gun is a tool for putting food on the table and for protecting your family. It is the last answer, not the first. You respect it, and you never, ever point it at another person unless your life, or the life of someone you love, is in danger. He let Jesse fire the rifle, the kick of it sending a jolt through the boy's small frame, the blast echoing off the face of the mesa. The can jumped from the log. A look of fierce pride and deep concentration was on Jesse's face. He was learning the lessons of the West, but they were now tempered with a wisdom born of tragedy. While Calder taught Jesse the ways of the land, May taught him the ways of the mind. In the evenings, by the light of the lantern, she would sit with him at the table. She had traded for a slate and a piece of chalk at the general store. She drew the letters, large and clear. A, B, C. A is for Ash Creek, she would say. Our home. B is for Boone, our name. C is for courage, what we must always have. Jesse, who had been a silent, haunted boy, now looked at the strange symbols on the slate with a hungry curiosity. He traced the letters with his finger, his brow furrowed in concentration. The world, which had once been a terrifying and unpredictable place, was slowly being ordered by these small, powerful marks. He was learning that a future could be written, not just endured. The small cabin, which had once been a refuge from a hostile world, was now a schoolhouse, a fortress, a home. It was a place where a family, forged in fire and bound by choice, was quietly, patiently, building a future, one lesson, one letter at a time. The seasons began to turn. The relentless heat of the long, dry summer finally broke, and the air in the mornings carried a new, sharp clarity. The leaves on the lone cottonwood by the well turned a brilliant, defiant yellow before letting go and drifting to the damp earth. The new barn, its raw pine already beginning to weather to a soft silver, stood as a testament to the town's penance and the promise of a future. Life on the homestead settled into a rhythm as gentle and steady as a sleeping heart. The days were filled with the small, quiet tasks of living. Calder moved with a purpose that was no longer driven by ghosts, but by the simple, profound need to provide. He split and stacked a mountain of firewood, its neat rows a bulwark against the coming cold. He repaired the roof of the cabin, his hammer blows a cheerful, rhythmic punctuation in the autumn quiet. He was a man remade, his silence no longer a wall of pain but a comfortable, shared space. Jesse was a different boy entirely. The haunted look had fled his eyes, replaced by the bright, open curiosity of a child who feels safe. He followed Calder everywhere, his small hands imitating his father's larger ones, learning to tie a knot, to read the clouds, to know the difference between the track of a deer and that of a coyote. And every evening, he sat with May, his brow furrowed in concentration as he painstakingly formed his letters on the slate, the chalk squeaking softly in the quiet cabin. The world was opening up to him, a book he was finally learning to read. May grew larger, her movements slower, more deliberate. The The life inside her was a constant, powerful presence. She spent her days in the gentle domesticity of her home, baking bread that filled the cabin with its warm, comforting scent, mending clothes, singing soft, tuneless songs to the child who had not yet been born. She and Calder moved around each other with an unspoken grace, a shared look across the room, the brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a cup of water. These small, quiet moments were the language of their love, a language more eloquent than any spoken word. The first pain came at dusk. It was a low, insistent ache that tightened across her back and then eased. She stopped what she was doing, her hand going to her belly. Calder was on the porch, watching the last of the sun's light bleed from the sky. He saw the change in her, the sudden stillness. He was inside in an instant, his face a mask of concern. "May," he said, his voice low. She gave him a small, reassuring smile. "It is time, Calder. It is just time." There was no panic in her voice, and it calmed the fear that had begun to rise in his chest. He helped her to her bed, his movements gentle, almost clumsy in their carefulness. He built up the fire in the hearth until the cabin was filled with a warm, steady glow. Jesse, seeing the gravity of the moment, came and sat on a small stool by the fire, his face pale and serious, his small hand clutching his wooden cross. "I will fetch Hannah," Calder said. May reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "You will not be long." "I will fly," he promised. His ride into town was a frantic, desperate prayer against the darkness. The moon was a thin sliver in the sky, and the trail was a treacherous ribbon of shadow. As he galloped into the main street of Ash Creek, the sound of his horse's hooves echoed off the silent storefronts. A light was on in the saloon, and a few men turned to stare as he pulled his horse to a skidding stop in front of the midwife's small house. He pounded on the door, his heart hammering in his chest. "Hannah! It is May! The baby is coming!" The door opened almost immediately. Hannah Pike stood there, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, a small bag already in her hand. It was as if she had been waiting. "I know, son," she said, her voice the calmest sound Calder had ever heard. "I saw the moon tonight. It is a birthing moon." The ride back was slower, more careful, with Hannah seated behind him on the horse, her small, frail body a surprising weight. As they approached the homestead, Calder saw a flicker of movement near the line of juniper trees that marked the edge of his property. It was a man, standing as still and silent as the trees themselves. Chayton. He was a shadow against the star-dusted sky, a guardian who had come, as promised. When the wind carried the news, he did not hail them. He simply stood his watch, his presence a silent blessing on the small cabin. The night was long. The cabin became a sacred, timeless space, lit only by the fire and a single lantern. Hannah Pike moved with a quiet, efficient grace. Her hands, though old and wrinkled, were steady and sure. She spoke to May in a low, crooning voice, a stream of encouragement and wisdom that was as old as the mountains themselves. Calder never left May's side. He sat on the edge of the bed, holding her hand. His large, calloused fingers intertwined with hers. He wiped her brow with a cool, damp cloth. He whispered to her, telling her of the strength of the mountains, of the new barn that stood waiting, of the son who sat by the fire, praying for her in his own silent way. He poured all of his own strength, all of his love, all of his hope into his touch, into his voice, willing it into her. And May was a warrior. She met each wave of pain with a deep, guttural groan that was not a sound of defeat, but of fierce, primal effort. She was bringing a new life into a world that had tried to deny her own, and she would not fail. Just before the dawn, as the sky in the east was beginning to soften from black to a deep, bruised purple, a new sound filled the small cabin. It was a thin, reedy cry, a sound of such fierce and fragile life that it seemed to stop the world from turning. Hannah cleaned the baby and wrapped it in a soft, clean cloth. "It is a girl," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "A strong, healthy girl." She placed the small bundle in May's waiting arms. May looked down at the tiny, perfect face of her daughter, and all the pain, all the fear, all the hardship of the past year melted away. There was only this miracle. She looked up at Calder, her eyes shining with tears. He leaned down and kissed her, a long, tender kiss that tasted of salt and wood smoke, and a love that had been forged in fire. Jesse crept over to the bed, his eyes wide with wonder, and peered at the tiny, wrinkled creature. He reached out a hesitant finger and gently touched his sister's cheek. The sun was just beginning to rise when Hannah Pike finally left, her work done. Calder walked her to the door. "You have a fine family, Calder Boone," she said, patting his arm. "Do not ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Calder stood on the porch, watching the dawn break over the red mesa. The sky was awash in colors of rose and gold. The world felt new, as if it had been born in the night, along with his daughter. He went back inside and gently lifted May, carrying her and the baby out onto the porch so they could watch the new day arrive together. Jesse followed, leaning against his father's leg. The four of them, a small, complete circle against the vastness of the plains. They were not alone for long. A wagon appeared on the trail, and then another. It was the people of Ash Creek. They came in a slow, silent procession. Jedediah and his wife, Thomas Miller, the blacksmith, the storekeeper, the Reverend Cole. They did not come with torches and anger. They came with gifts, loaves of fresh bread, jars of milk, a small, hand-carved cradle, a pile of neatly folded baby clothes. They did not speak much. They did not need to. They walked up to the porch, placed their simple offerings down, and looked at the new family. They looked at May, her face glowing with a tired, radiant beauty. They looked at Calder, the mountain man, his face transformed by a love so fierce it was almost a visible thing. They looked at the tiny, perfect new life cradled in its mother's arms. And as they looked, their eyes filled with tears. These were the tears the town of Ash Creek had been promised. Not tears of sorrow, but the cleansing tears of redemption. Tears for the cruelty they had shown, and for the grace they had been given. Tears of joy for a life that had been saved, for a family that had been born, for a community that had, against all odds, found its own soul. They left as quietly as they had come, leaving the family alone in the peace of the new morning. May looked at Calder, her heart so full it felt as if it might burst. They had a home, they had a family, they had a future. In the distance, a sound drifted on the clear, clean air. It was a faint, lonely sound, the whistle of a train, miles away, making its steady progress across the plains. The world was still out there. The tracks of steel were still being laid. The future would bring its own challenges, its own heartaches. But as May and Calder looked at each other, a silent understanding passed between them. They were no longer afraid. Whatever came, they would face it together. They had learned the West's hardest and most beautiful lesson that a home is not a place you find, but a thing you build, with your own two hands, and with all the love in your heart. Thank you for listening to our story, and we invite you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.